in our search for life on other planets, we've been looking at different places in our solar system, and we're doing a tour of the inner planets. So far we've done Mercury and Venus and our own moon, and now let's talk about Mars. This one is a big one because it's one of the most interesting places to look at. In fact, it's currently the place we're exploring the most. I mean, we talk about the word Mars, but I mean, if you imagine some sort of alien, some people actually call it a Martian, for example. I mean, that's sometimes a term that we use. Well, that actually would be something from Mars. So if there's life that is actually from Mars, we would say it's Martian. So that's an interesting term, I think. Now, if we look at Mars itself, I mean, why is it actually interesting for us? I mean, early astronomers, they used to look at Mars and they used to think that there were canals. So they actually thought, oh, there must be Martian life on there. And they saw these black sort of patterns here. Now, their telescopes weren't as good as, for example, this picture here. So they couldn't see all the details. But they actually thought that there were canals that were built by Martian civilizations. So it was very exciting for people until they sent some probes, some robots to actually go fly near there. And when they flew near there, they saw that, oh, it's actually a red planet and there aren't really canals. Those are just light and dark spots. And we don't think that there's much crawling around there at the moment. So you might think, oh, that's really too bad. Why would we bother? Well, we bother because Mars does have an atmosphere. So it has this layer of gas around it. And although its atmosphere is fairly thin now, it was actually a lot thicker in the past. Now, its temperature is between minus 140 degrees Celsius. That's a little bit cold, quite cold, but all the way up to plus 35. And that's actually quite nice and warm. So it can be anywhere between these two temperatures. So it really widely ranges depending on the season and if you're in the light or the dark side. But so its temperature is somewhat reasonable, at least a lot better than, super searing temperatures like Venus and Mercury. So, I mean, its temperatures aren't that bad. And it has water ice at the poles. When I say water ice, I mean there is lots of it. So there's lots of H2O. There's lots of this water in ice form. So, I mean, there's lots at the North and at South Pole. So much, in fact, I mean, you could actually cut off a chunk. You could bring it into your house if you could somehow do that. And you could actually use it in a glass of water. It should be really nice. It's about 99% pure water. Ice, of course. So there's no liquid water as far as we know, but there certainly is water ice. So that's very interesting. That there is water there, it's just in ice form. And there's also some traces of it in the atmosphere as well. So that's pretty interesting for us. Now what I'm going to do is show you a bunch of pictures taken on Mars or taken of Mars. And one of the interesting things is this, that Mars had liquid water in the past. It was theorized and postulated that maybe it did, but now we're quite sure it did. And I think that is really, really important. Now, it had liquid water, but it no longer has liquid water. How could that be? How could it change? Well, we actually think that this is because of, again, atmospheres. If you think about your own atmosphere, I think I was drawing this before. This is us, for example, on Earth. And on Earth, we have our own atmosphere that's pushing against us. And this push keeps our bodies happy, but it turns out that push also keeps water liquid. So the atmosphere pressure keeps water liquid, or at least in that case it can keep the water liquid. At least on Earth it does. But the problem is that right now Mars doesn't have a thick enough or a big enough atmospheric pressure to keep the water liquid. It's too weak. It doesn't push enough on the water to keep it liquid. So instead the water is in gas form or in solid form, but it doesn't go to liquid form. In fact, it goes directly from solid to gas. It skips the liquid phase. It's actually called sublimation. But it had liquid water in the past. Now, how in the world do we know that? We can actually look at patterns taken, well, these are pictures taken, for example, from satellites that are orbiting Mars. And in this particular picture, you can see these flow patterns like this. These are caused on Earth by water. Water can actually sort of flow from different sources, and it gets, they connect. This is a higher area, this is a lower region, and so this water would then flow downwards. So you see these flow patterns, these water channels. That's a strong piece of evidence. There's another strong piece of evidence that shows that there's some clays that they've found, so some materials that they've found that can only form in liquid water, and those have been found on the surface of Mars. So that tells us that those rocks had to have been formed in liquids. So there was liquid water somewhere. They've found some ancient stream beds. And in fact, this is a very recent one. There's a NASA rover called Curiosity that's currently roving around Mars, taking lots of pictures. And this just made the news, at least in 2013, that Curiosity took this picture, and some very clever scientists, including people here in Copenhagen, analyzed these little pebbles. And these little pebbles, these little rocks, they're actually very rounded. And the only mechanism that we know that rounds rocks so much is water. So those small rounded pebbles, those show that they were rounded due to flowing water. And that water, they can even estimate that the water was between 10 centimeters and a meter deep. And it actually flowed at a speed, somewhat similar to a stream on Earth. So how interesting is that? We've got all this proof that Mars used to have liquid water. And that is why it's exciting. The reason it's exciting is because if there was liquid water on Mars before, does that mean that there was life before? So I think that's really interesting. Okay, so liquid water in the past. So this is sort of the key thing here. So we're quite sure that it had liquid H2O in the past. Does that mean that there was life in the past? Question mark. We don't know this answer here, but it is really interesting because it's a place that we know that there used to be liquid water. By the way, isn't this a beautiful picture? This is a sunset taken on Mars. So this is a Martian sunset. How nice. Now this is a picture taken by a rover called Spirit. So this is a NASA rover that's, it's sitting on Mars right now, but it's not currently working. It got stuck. But Spirit was driving around, and it was taking pictures of rocks. So you can see its tracks here. It goes around, it looks around here. And you can see these little white spots here. That's actually frost. So, for example, on Earth, if it's a cold night, and sometimes you wake up the next morning and you see this sort of frost there, you could sort of lick it and it's sort of water, but it's in its ice form. That same stuff is on Mars. So there is some water in the atmosphere. There's some in gas form. So that's pretty interesting. And I love these tracks. I think it looks really cool to see that. There's another rover called Opportunity, and that one is also roving around, and this is a picture that it took. So it drove up to the edge of this crater here. I think it's called Victoria Crater here. Took some pictures, and they decided not to have it drive down. They had it, so it took some pictures and then sort of drove out again. And what is absolutely amazing is that this particular little rover here, it was designed not to last that long. Both Spirit and Opportunity were actually designed to last only 90 days, 90 Martian days, that is. But actually, Opportunity is still driving 9 years later. So this little one that took these pictures here is still driving around. Isn't that cool? And in fact, it detected lots of really interesting things. So in fact, they just realized that Opportunity took some pictures. So even though it's not the newest rover, it actually took some pictures that show that not only was there liquid water in the past, but it was even, they can actually tell that the water was actually sort of drinkable. It wasn't too salty. So it was actually sort of like nice drinkable water. That's so cool that we know these things. Now, I love this picture. I think it's a really nice one here. But actually, this reminds me that, the conditions on Mars 2 to 3 billion years ago, those were such that liquid water could be there. So this brings up this tie again with abiogenesis, that if you just needed the right conditions to have life, then life forms. Well, that's why we think that there might have been, life in the past, because if there was liquid water and it has all the other parts that you need to have life, maybe it had life. We still don't know the answer to this, but it's really interesting. I think this is a really beautiful picture. This is actually, this is you are here. This is this little dot right here. That is what the Earth looks like from Mars. That tiny little dot that's been sort of blown up here in this picture, sort of expanded here. That is what the Earth looks like from Mars. if you ever look up at the sky and you know where to look at for Mars, again, using one of these little apps, for example, I mean, Mars looks like a little dot in the sky. So isn't that cool that from Mars, for example, that Earth looks like that tiny little dot? That's where we live. That's where you live. Now, there's even dust devils on Mars. You ever seen these little things? I know in Copenhagen, at least, when it's really windy, you have these sort of spirals of air here, and sometimes, garbage and other leaves and things like that spin around. Well, those things even happen on Mars. Some conspiracy theorists were like, oh my God, there's aliens. No, there's just an atmosphere and there's winds, that's all. But it's still really interesting that there are actually dust devils on Mars. Now, there have been lots of missions to go to Mars and to look at Mars and to do different things. This is only a few of them. Viking was one in the 70s, and it was actually the first, and as far as I know, the only one that had an actual experiment that was designed to detect life. I mean, it had a little scoop, and it scooped up some soil and actually sort of cooked it on its back, basically, and tried to look at, was there or is there life there? And I think it's the only one still that actually had an experiment to try to detect actual living life. The problem was that 3 of the 4 experiments said no, there is no life, and one of them said maybe. But scientists can't really agree on that extra one, for example, because there are some explanations that could have formed this result that were not life. But all the missions now, they're looking at the conditions on Mars and the past conditions on Mars. So although there's lots of talk of manned missions to Mars, that is a big challenge. The reason is because if you want to go there in person, it's a very long trip to get there. It could take, over a year. You'd have problems with food and with water. You'd have to have your body survive the really low gravity. We'd have really weak people by the time they landed there, it turns out. Now, actually, there's a really good book that I really liked. It's not exactly about Mars, but it's actually, I highly recommend it. It's called Packing for Mars. It's by a really talented author, I think. Her name is Mary Roach. She's done a whole bunch of other funny books, but she writes so well. What she did is she talked about, the science of getting ready to go to space and what happens to the human body in space. So it's a really easy read. It's actually super, super funny. She's got all these crazy examples of what they did in order to sort of get used to going to space and how that would actually affect people going to Mars. So there are some plans, for example, that, how would you build your spaceship and how would you survive? So this is a really good book. If you ever have a chance to get your hands on this book, get it, buy it. It is fantastic. It's an easy read. It's not very sort of deep or difficult. It's a very easy read, on a day when you're kind of tired, just read this. I'm pretty sure you're going to laugh. And if not, you're certainly going to find it interesting. She writes very, very well. But in any case, about these experiments here, we've got Viking. That was one of the ones to look for life on Mars. Then they had a little robot that actually drove around. That was called Pathfinder. And then next came Spirit and Opportunity. Those came together. And Opportunity is still driving 9 years later. That one's still driving around. So that is really cool. So 9 years later, oops, it looks like Tater. 9 years later, it's still driving. There's another one called Phoenix that landed near its North Pole. That one couldn't drive around, but it did lots of really interesting experiments. And the newest one that is currently driving around is called Curiosity. It's actually called the Mars Science Laboratory, but it's nicknamed Curiosity. Now, all the other landers, they used a really neat landing system where basically, if you imagine this is the surface, they're worried about, how can you slow down your little lander before, so it lands. And what they did, they essentially inflated a bunch of airbags. So as it was landing here, they would just sort of inflate a whole bunch of balloons around it. It would sort of bounce, go boing, 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 boing. When it would land, it would deflate the balloons, open itself up, turn itself around, of course, and then drive around. But that only works for small robots. They want to make a huge one. So NASA worked on this one called MSL, the Mars Science Laboratory, and it landed just recently on Mars. And it had a completely crazy landing system. And this is actually what it was called a sky crane. So this right here, the idea was they would have a spaceship that would hold on to the rover. So the rover was sort of attached to the spaceship. And then as the spaceship came lower, it would fire these thrusters sort of to slow its descent. As it did that, it would actually lower the robot onto a crane, like on this, by wires here. And then it would, when the rover actually touched the ground, it would cut the cables, and then this piece right here would fly away and crash because we don't care about that one. And this one here can drive around. And it's the size of a small car, so it's really huge. And I think it's amazing that this actually even worked. I think it's so cool that it happened. And of course, it's taken some really cool pictures. This is one that was taken by it. And you might wonder, how in the world did they take this picture? Did a Martian take the picture? And I want you to try to figure out how you think it could have been taken. This is done through a little bit of photo manipulation. It's not aliens, it's not a trick. Well, I suppose it's a bit of a trick. But this is a real picture, or stitched together of some real pictures of Curiosity as it drives around. You can see it's got little scoops, and it's scooping up the soil and doing all sorts of neat experiments. It even has a laser beam on top that can actually sort of fire at rocks, and it can look at the material the rock is made of, all from far away. It doesn't even have to go up to the rock. It can do it remotely, which is so cool. So they've got this mission on Mars right now, and it's driving around. How awesome is that?